Hope you are enjoying the conference and had a good lunch. So it's time to get started with our next session, the afternoon session. It's my pleasure to welcome Yolanda Smith, the head of cybersecurity at Grubhub. She has extensive experience in this area. She has worked with Sweet Green prior to that as head of cybersecurity, and before that as business information security officer at Target. Yolanda likes to work with organizations that expose women and girls of color to careers in cybersecurity. Let's extend a warm welcome to the next speaker.
Yay, I get you all right after lunch, so hopefully you're good and sleepy. As the intro called out, I'm Yolanda Smith. I'm going to get the opportunity to talk with you today about how do you fight through an attack. Now, there's a big number on the screen in front of you right now, and generally I shy away from big numbers, but in this case, it's appropriate, right? So according to Security Magazine, in 2022, there were roughly 2,220 cyber attacks every single day. That's one cyber attack every 39 seconds. Doing the math, that comes out to 800,000 cyber attacks over 1 year. Intuitively, we know that attackers do not discriminate when it comes to achieving their goals. A cyber attack can affect any industry, any vertical, any sector, any size business, no matter if you're in a school like University of Minnesota or if you are working at a water treatment facility. Doesn't matter how new or how old the business is. Chances are good that if you haven't already dealt with the cyber attack, you will very soon. But how do you do that without fully disrupting your core business? That's what I'm going to talk with you about today. Again, my name's Yolanda Smith. I'm the head of cybersecurity at Grubhub, and my goal today is to show you how to fight through a cyber attack. This talk is broken into 3 sections. First, the things that you need to do before the attack happens. I know that kind of sounds like cheating. How do you kind of get ahead of the attack when I'm supposed to be talking to you about what to do during the attack? But taking these steps will actually help you identify and mitigate and recover from a cyber attack faster and cheaper than if you don't take these steps. Second, the things that you need to do in the midst of a cyber attack. Now, admittedly, you're going to hear what I'm saying, and you're going to think, yeah, these are all no-brainer steps. So why are you talking to me about this, Yolanda? But you'd be surprised at how many of these things, how many teams fail to do these things and find themselves suffering from the same attack over and over and over again at ever-increasing cost and expense, and of course, downtime to your core services. And the third thing we're going to go through is the things you need to do to come back safely from a cyber attack. Again, in the heat of the moment, your teams are going to make snap decisions and judgments about how to stop an attack in progress. Once you've gotten a little bit of breathing room, you need to be able to make sure you're considering what it will take to come back safely. So we've talked about my goals. Let's talk about your goal. When a cyber attack occurs, it's likely that whatever system, service, application, or platform that was hit will not be firing on all cylinders. So what are we going to be working toward? So what we're going to be working toward is the steps it'll take to come back to full operational capability. Coming back to full operational capability starts before the service ever comes under attack, or at least that you know of. The first step is to calibrate your blank meter. We'll say, oh crap, for the sake of the kids in the room, okay? Earmuffs for anybody that doesn't want to hear it, okay? So take a second and think about this. Consider your overall platform or service that you offer. Is there a component or a microservice that comes to mind that if it were to be hit by an attacker, you would immediately think, oh crap, right? There's got to be that moment when like you're just all the color goes out of your face and you're like, oh no. Now the next question is, does everyone on your team feel that way? If there's something that you'd call an oh crap moment, but someone else on your team might be like, meh, that's when it's time to calibrate your oh crap meter. Okay, why is it important to do this exercise? Ultimately, it lets you know when it's really time to panic versus dealing with something that's mildly annoying. It ensures that you're not just grossly underreacting to things as well as wildly overreacting to things. Either one of these can make it easier for an attacker to achieve their goals while making it harder for you to achieve yours. Now, I'm gonna say something that's somewhat obvious, but a bit distasteful. Not all attacks are five-alarm fires. And I say that to the security people in the room. Not all attacks are five-alarm fires. We do have a tendency to treat everything as if it's a calling all cars moment. Being able to distinguish the five-alarm fires from the mild annoyances and having a clear head about what those differences are will not only ensure that you're correct, that will ensure that you're set up to correctly remediate them effectively. Furthermore, it helps to ensure that everyone is aligned on the components and services that really matter and which ones are peripheral to the core operations of your business. That's not to say that an attacker won't exploit those peripheral services, but it tells us that the impact of those exploits won't be as severe to your business, right? And again, it helps you to calibrate that oh crap meter. Finally, completing this exercise allows us to reduce the time to incident classification. Think about how you would react to a high severity moment versus a low severity moment, all right? Now, what happens if you haven't done that and you have no idea what the severity of the event is? You're just sort of doing stuff, right? What do? Security teams will tend to err on the side of overclassification. As the head of cybersecurity at Grubhub, we think everything is a SEV 2 or above. It's our nature to be paranoid. However, talking to operations teams, they tend to err on the side of underclassification, specifically if we can't directly pinpoint, hey, it's this exact attack that's happening. It may not be an attack. It might just be, let's just say, your autoscaler failing or something like that. The playbooks, however, for each one of those approaches may be wildly different. And as a result, a lot of teams waste time trying to figure out how to react instead of actually reacting, which of course gives attackers that much more time to run roughshod over your systems. Now, hopefully, the diagram on the screen isn't super new to the folks in this room. You've seen a risk matrix before, and you know that it's designed to clarify those high-risk events versus low-risk events based upon likelihood and impact. This is a very basic version of calibrating your OCRAP meter, right? It's very basic, but you'd be surprised, once again, how many teams don't do this. The idea is, of course, to consider a series of events which could affect a platform, a system, or a service, and determine the relative impact of said event. That's part of the responsibilities of being a service owner, is being able to have those types of conversations. These have been around forever, and it's one of those things that if you haven't already built it into your toolkit as part of your service ownership process, go ahead and dust it off. It definitely should help you to identify what to do when a cyber attack is and how to react when a cyber attack occurs and why it matters. So I want everyone to do this with me. I know, again, it's after lunch, but I want you to close your eyes and imagine you're standing at the top of a tall building in the middle of a city. Again, this is gonna get a little ASMR on you. I have a very soothing voice. I get that, but stay with me here. It's a clear day and you can see everything going on the street below. You're in the United States, and you can see some cars are moving in the right direction. You can see that the lights are changing from red to green, and cars are basically following the pattern that they're supposed to follow. You can see that the cars are actually on the street and not on the sidewalk. You can see people walking on the sidewalks at various speeds. There are some older people, some people who are differently abled, who are going at maybe a little bit slower. You see bikes and scooters moving along on the sidewalk, which you're not supposed to be there. And of course, you can see some stationary objects that are just not moving, like trees and traffic signals and storefronts and things like that. For the most part, hopefully that all seems like just a regular day in the life of a city, right? Now, imagine that the trees suddenly uprooted themselves and began slapping around the pedestrians. Now, next, imagine that, a car that's supposed to be moving with traffic stops abruptly in the middle of the road and starts blasting house music loud enough to shatter the storefront windows. Now, you're the only one that can see all of this from this perspective. Would any of this spur any alarm or concern for you? Would that maybe, make you say, something's not right here? Knowing that these events were possibilities, how would you tell the city planner to protect against this? How would that conversation go with the city planner? Hey, there's a chance that the trees are going to uproot themselves and become sentient and start attacking people. Just think about that as you're planning the city, right? Now that was a crazy example, but it's meant to highlight that it's just as important to understand what an attack will look like in the first place as it is to understand how to react to one, right? Now, if there's any security people in the room, earmuffs once again, because I know you're either rolling your eyes or clenching your teeth, that I put up a kill chain on the screen. But in this case, it's actually illustrative to my larger point. Specifically, that the way an attack looks will be different depending upon where the attacker is in their process. So in order to disrupt that process, you need to understand what bad looks like for your service at each stage in the kill chain. I know this is super hard to read, so don't strain yourself trying to read each one of these little things in the circle, and again, you'll get the slides later if you wish, but the macro point is that the attackers have a general sort of method to their madness. As an example, if your core business is, say, a food sales and delivery app, which tends to peak in urban markets at lunch hour, seeing a bunch of 400-style errors across your endpoints from a single IP address is indicative of someone who's poking around trying to learn the soft spots in each of those endpoints. In essence, they're casing the joint, they're doing recon. By the same token, if you saw a bunch of 403 errors from your login endpoint from dozens of IP addresses and user agents within a very short amount of time, that's a big clue that the attacker already has some amount of knowledge and data about how your service is architected and is now trying to discover more about what they can get with that knowledge. They've now taken the thing that they've learned from recon and they're starting to apply that knowledge in a systematic way. The next step that they're going to take is to try to gain legitimate access and then escalate that access. If they were to actually achieve that goal and pivot into higher level accesses, where would you look? What would that look like in your system, right? Maybe you'll look at your ACLs, maybe you'll look at your security groups, maybe you'll look across regions and see exactly who's has the opportunity to access services that they wouldn't normally attempt to access. But in the worst case scenario, the attacker would actually gain legitimate access to a higher level data source. And the next thing they're going to do is they're going to try to abscond with it. So where do you look from there? From that point, maybe you want to look at your egress logs, right? You want to see, do we have strange outbound connections to S3 buckets, to services that you've never heard of, to endpoints that you don't own, right? You're going to look and see whether or not there are things taking place outside of your network boundary that are trying to reverse proxy in. These are all things that might cause you to stop and take a look and say, okay, well, what would an attack look like in my environment? For this specific application, I've given you, and I've just told you what to look for and where to look for it based upon the steps in the kill chain. And this is something that you could and should be doing too. Now, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard engineers and operators say, well, this thing is something that an attacker will never be able to figure out. They'll never be able to guess my super interesting code for a success message. They'll never get that. It has been said before, but security through obscurity, just plain and simple, does not work. You should assume that the core business logic of your service can and will be reverse engineered. You should assume that the weird esoteric error codes that are returned on a malformed request aren't some secret coded language that only you and your team are aware of. Unless, of course, you're taking the step to encrypt them, at which point, sayonara to your app's performance. Ultimately, though, you should, again, assume that the attacker knows as much or more than about your service as you do. Pretend that they were in the room with you when it was first designed and conceived. Now the question becomes, what can they do with that information and what will it look like? That assumption is really, and that question is really nothing more than completing a threat model. Now, I'm sure the folks in this room have heard of threat modeling before. There's been plenty of talks and blogs and white papers on various threat modeling frameworks, and I'm not going to go into detail on that here, but I will put some resources in at the end of the presentation if you are interested in learning more about sort of formulaic threat modeling. Ultimately, what all of those models and frameworks would say is this: if an attacker were to know what you know, what could they do, and what would the impact be? Now, if you can get really crisp on the what would it look like answer, you can mitigate the worst of the impact of the cyber attack. The answers to that question are your indicators of attack. Now, throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me say, let's pretend. I'm a big pretender because that's part of what it means to threat model, and that's part of what it means to understand how to survive an attack. So let's pretend that you are the manager of a bank. Your job is to ensure that the legitimate customers have access to their money and only their money while preventing thieves and robbers from gaining illegitimate access to other people's money. In order to prevent that outcome, maybe you'd add video cameras all around the bank, you'd hire a security guard to patrol the grounds, you'd put all the money behind an expensive vault, you'd limit access to the vault and select a few team members that can actually get into it. The vault itself, of course, will require a complex series of steps by at least 2 people in order to open it, and even then, it would only open during business hours. Now, think about this for a second from the perspective of the bank robber. Knowing what you know about the bank and the precautions that they have in place, what would you need to do in order to rob it? For sure, you need a plan to come in at a very specific time, of course, because the vault doesn't open after business hours unless you plan on blowing it up, which is going to, of course, be very noisy and attract a lot of attention. You'd probably want to cut the video feeds. And since multiple managers are required to open the vault, you probably need to have a couple of insiders. So that's going to require either paying them off or stalking them long enough to blackmail them into doing what you want. Thinking back to that bank manager, the bank manager walks in after lunch one day and sees that the security guard is splayed out on the floor, the vault door is wide open, and the money is missing, along with, of course, 2 of the managers. All of those things are indicators of compromise, not of attack. Something has happened, and this is the evidence that something has happened. Now, if you were clever enough to have all the video backed up to the cloud versus having it on-premise, not stored locally, you could go review the video and see not only the robbery in progress and all the key players, but you could also see the events leading up to the robbery, right? Namely that a group of men might have been parked across the street from the bank for weeks ahead of the robbery. And while they changed clothes, sometimes the men would get out of the car and walk around the bank looking at certain doors and windows, maybe even making gestures at the video cameras. On more than one occasion, you may have even seen one of the men quietly following the security guard as he made his rounds, checking and seeing exactly where and when they stopped and what they checked for when they stopped. And of course, another one of the men might have been always waiting outside to flirt with the new bank teller when she came out for a smoke break. All of those things are precursors to an attack and indicators to an attack. So once you've identified what those indicators of attack are going to be, it's important that you codify them in such a way that you can recognize them for what they are and react to them accordingly. Of course, they might be in the form of service level indicators, service level objectives, KPIs, KRIs, or metrics, but you need some way to distinguish security service level objectives versus your operational service level objectives because they are different. Of course, this is kind of the stuff that no one really loves to do is to think about business continuity and disaster recovery planning, but those are key parts of any resilience strategy, right? Deliberate focus and commitment on business continuity and disaster recovery is a key part of understanding and establishing technology resilience. But often, of course, teams don't take the step of talking through specifically how a security event may influence their business continuity and disaster recovery plans, especially if that event is prolonged or devastating. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I am not a business continuity professional. There are certainly more full-featured talks and discussions and details on those matters, but I do want to point out a couple of sort of key tenets from the business continuity world and highlight why they alone aren't enough to describe what it means to recover from a cyber attack. And I'm going to show you that using a new metric that I just made up. The recovery time objective, or RTO, gives us the targeted time period between when an event failure occurs to when operations are expected to resume. In the example that I've got on the screen here, if an organization has set an RTO for a specific service at 4 hours and an event occurs at noon, then the service is expected to recover by 4 p.m., right? Similarly, a recovery point objective, or RPO, is the acceptable amount of data loss which can occur during the period of an incident. In this example, the RPO is set at 5 hours, meaning that the organization has accepted that a maximum loss of 5 hours worth of data. In order to assure that, they take backups every 5 hours, such that if a data backup is taken at noon and an event occurs sometime between noon and the next backup at 5, then the most amount of data that the organization is going to lose is based upon that noon restoration point, right? So anything that happens before 5, they're gonna potentially lose, because they're only gonna have the stuff up till noon. Now you'll notice that neither of those metrics give any indication as to whether or not restoring service can be done with any amount of assurance or safety, right? Namely, if you only measure your recovery based upon your RTO, you may be restoring a service which is still subject to the same vulnerabilities and exploits that took it down in the first place, which is where this new third metric comes in, which I'm calling the integrity recovery objective. This isn't something that you're gonna necessarily see in any trade text or any BCP manuals or anything like that, but the idea is to set a goal for when a service can be safely returned to operations with a high amount of assurance and integrity. It's going to be longer than your RTO, right? It's going to potentially be longer than your RPO, but the idea is that the business should make the decision to restore a service in the midst of a cyber attack, knowing that doing so without fully resolving the issues that led to its going down might lead to more business continuity challenges in the long term, right? You're operating in a place of non-safety. Which brings me to my next point. Knowing what you can and can't do in the midst of a cyber attack before the attack occurs will help you return to service quicker and with greater assurance and trust in the service, because you'll be focused on fixing the vulnerability or removing the opportunity of exploitation from the attacker. So from my military days, we would talk about something called D5 as part of doctrine. D5 in that parlance stands for deny, degrade, deceive, disrupt, and destroy. In the midst of a cyber attack, those are going to be the options that you have on the table, with one notable exception, and that's destruction. So in denial, of course, you can lock out accounts, you can throw up 403 pages, you can revoke and rotate keys. With degradation, you can intentionally scale back your service. If you're working on some sort of a hydration model, you can scale it down. You can throw up rate limits. With deception, you can use canary tokens, and you can send people to non-routable subnets to make the attacker think that they got something they didn't actually get, so you can learn more about their tactics and build up your defenses. With disruption, you can create and deploy security groups or access control lists that prohibits attackers from being able to move freely throughout your environment. And then, of course, the last bit, with destruction, you can decide to take down parts of your infrastructure to completely remove the attacker's opportunity to leverage it for their own gains. Now, you'll notice that I said your infrastructure. It's because there are some things you cannot do, at least in the United States of America, and still maintain the moral, in some cases legal, high ground. First, you cannot attack back. You can't. This isn't that movie. It's not. You may take only the necessary steps to stop the attacker from inflicting harm on your services. Additionally, you may not destroy someone else's infrastructure. In a lot of cases, what attackers will do is they'll use third-party hot points in order to get where they want to go. So by taking the step of destroying their infrastructure, you might actually be destroying an unassuming victim's infrastructure, and you still don't get the attacker, which is, you've wasted a bunch of time. If you take down innocent bystanders, you're also bringing in the company to liability that they may not be willing to take on. Now, this third one might be a little controversial, but you don't want to start making grand assertions about who the attacker is, especially if you think that you've got, some details around whether it's a government or state-level entity. At the end of the day, attribution is notoriously difficult, and state-level and government-level actors have gotten really good at sort of hiding in plain sight and making their tradecraft and making their attacks look like that of other people and other indicators of compromise. So if you go and you're chasing what you think is, a state level actor, you could find yourself wasting a bunch of time because you feel like you've correctly attributed an attack that wasn't necessary to attribute at this point. You definitely don't want to violate any laws, ethics, or regulations in an effort to stop the attacker or to return fire to the attacker. To the greatest extent possible, you need to be working with law enforcement and not against them on these matters. And that will, because if you don't do that, it'll definitely hinder progress, right? Finally, you must not make any comment or claim without consulting with your organization's PR or comms teams. I know that, as in the middle of attack, emotions will be running high, people will be coming at you with questions, you're gonna have people coming out of the woodwork. As the details of the attack, if it does ultimately become public, what you will find, especially as engineers and operators, is that reporters will start to come out of the woodwork and will ask. They'll ping you on Slack, they'll ping you on Discord, they'll ping you on Twitter, they'll get to your LinkedIn, and they'll ask for details that might not be in the press release. I'm just gonna say it, don't do it, don't do it. Part of the reason is that it limits your personal liability. If you do feel like there's gross negligence or deceptive practices or behaviors, you should instead work through filing a formal whistleblower complaint versus spilling the beans to the press, okay? So, what are your obligations in the event of a cyber attack? The first is that you need to know when to involve law enforcement and which law enforcement to involve, right? So if you are working, let's say, in the critical infrastructure sector, that's water, lights, power, electricity, gas. If you're working in the critical infrastructure sector, your go-to is gonna be the CISA or the Department of Homeland Security. If you're in retail and maybe you're dealing with some gift card fraud, you might need to actually work with the Secret Service, depending upon the threshold of what the actual attack is. Under a certain amount, it's the Secret Service. Above a certain amount, it's the FBI. At a minimum, though, you do want to get into the habit, no matter what type of attack it is, of contacting and involving the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. I put a link to it here in the slides, and of course, you'll have access to it at the end. The next thing that you want to make sure that you do, your next biggest obligation, is to preserve evidence. Logs, documents, meeting notes, decisions. You're going to be moving fast, and there's a chance that you might either A, need to roll back to a previous version of your app, or B, turn over the evidence of the crime to law enforcement. You will need to make sure that you understand exactly what it is that took place that either A, caused you to roll back, or B, you might need to go back to those logs and reference them again as part of a deposition or as part of some sort of a prosecution event. This next one is kind of near and dear to my heart, and it's examining your vendor relationships. Just about all of us are working on platforms and products that require a close and tight relationship with third-party vendors and supply chains. Now, about this time last year, a company called Forrester, if you know Forrester, or if you know Gartner, Forrester does the same kind of a thing. But Forrester put out a report about the state of cybersecurity in 2022. They're due to put out another one this year. And in that report, what they said was 2/3 of all cyber attacks in 2022 were going to come from third parties or supply chain vendors, software supply chain. And sad to say that actually proved to be true. Why is it so important to make sure that you know and understand your vendor relationships? Well, I got a story about that. And here's the story. So on the screen, you can see that this is a screenshot from an article from SC Media. And the headline reads, "Will the CodeCov breach become the next big software supply chain hack?" The picture right underneath that is a company called Sweetgreen. Happened to be the company that I was working for at the time. Guess how I found out that Sweetgreen uses CodeCov? By reading this article. That's not the way I wanted to find out. right? So the gist of the details is that CodeCov, which provides some amount of like testing coverage, and it's embedded in GitHub, and it runs in an automated fashion. They got owned, and after they got owned, the attacker used that to pivot and look at and try to get creds and details from CodeCov's customers, right? Of which one of them was Sweetgreen. Now, CodeCov, doing the right thing, they reached out when they found out this behavior happened. This happened on April 1st of 2021. But they reached out to the contact that they had on file to let them know that, hey, there's a security event that took place on our systems. You probably want to take the step of rotating your keys and passwords. Well, the person that they reached out to had left the company 2 years ago. Oops. GitHub also took the step of reaching out. They reached out to a developer that they had on file to let them know that, hey, we see that you all are using CodeCov. CodeCov is in the news as having been breached. You probably want to take the step to rotate your keys and passwords and make sure that there's not secrets embedded in your repos. Well, the developer that received that email had been on vacation for 2 weeks and didn't see it. So fast forward 2 weeks, this article comes out, and a friend of mine sends it to me and says, hey, Yolanda, are you okay? And I said, what are you talking about? And this is how I found out that Sweetgreen was a CodeCov customer, a big CodeCov customer. The long story short is that it's super duper important. Like it ended up not being a big deal. We did get keys and creds rotated, and the repos that they had access to were of no consequence. But that was a huge, huge near miss for us. And it came down to poor communication. It came down to us not having a really good grip on what our suppliers and what what we were using them for. We didn't have a strong amount of justification for keeping CodeCov. And ultimately, we gave the attacker an extra 2 weeks of time to just sort of do whatever. Now, we got really lucky that they didn't turn into something much worse beyond this news article, but can't tell you how scary that was for us in the moment. So I spent a good chunk of time talking about what to do before, because most of what it takes to actually fight through an attack happens before the attack actually happens. But now, here's the attack. The first thing I want you to focus on is containment. You have to stop the bleeding. You have to stop the attacker from being able to move and propagate and have unfettered access to your systems and services. You have to cut them off. What could that look like? Maybe you want to fail over to another region, presuming that the attacker does not have access to that other region. That could mean taking a service offline. That's kind of the worst case scenario. But at this point in time, we're talking about blunt instrument applications here, right? Taking a service offline is a blunt instrument. Revoking keys and scopes and accesses, also a blunt instrument. Rolling back to the last known good version. Perhaps that at least pushes the attacker out long enough that you have time to patch that version before you go forward again. Restoring from backups, if you're using some sort of a red-green failover, that can help. Or even you can degrade the service by, again, if you've got a hydration model in place, you can bring it down to 50% hydration, 25% hydration. You can decide to proactively disable certain features in your apps and services. But a big one is going to be, if it came from a third-party supplier, you have to ask whether or not it's time to destroy or disconnect from some of those explicit trust relationships. After that, you have to neutralize the attacker's ability to inflict harm on your business. Of course, what could that look like? Maybe it's rate limiting, maybe it's sinkholing. Again, these are all going to be blunt instrument things that you're doing in the heat of the moment just to buy yourself some time. You have to be able to get them away from you so that way you have the opportunity to bolster your defenses. Again, it could be locking accounts, isolation, taking on, changing up your ACLs to isolate them to a non-routable subnet, anything to just sort of keep them from being able to actually attack you. Now, I don't have any pithy slides to go behind this one, right? But what I will say is that if you are a service owner and your service is getting attacked, it's super important not to get defensive or get an attitude when people start asking questions about your service itself and how it's architected. The amount of times I've been in an incident with an engineer or a subject matter expert, and they come in, they're all puffed up, and they're like, it's not my stuff, bro, all right? Please. Right, they're already kind of like, they have their guard up. Meanwhile, the attacker, while we're trying to convince them that yes, this is happening, the attacker's doing whatever they want to do, and they're pivoting throughout the other services, right? All said, you have to kind of take a step back, right? It's perfectly normal to have pride in authorship. It's perfectly normal to have pride in what you work on, but it's also the time during an attack to recognize that, yes, it can happen to you. Yes, it can be your service. Yes, it can be your system. It can happen. So again, start from the assumption that the attacker knows as much about your service as you do and work objectively from there. Perhaps the attacker exploited a design flaw that you don't feel like is a design flaw, but they exploited it nonetheless, so now you have to deal with it. If you start throwing up a bunch of blockers because you don't want to believe it could happen to you, then you're just going to give the attacker that much more time to do whatever it is that they want to do. Next little bit, focus on short-term gains next. What does that mean? So you've got a little bit of breathing room, you've got a little bit of pressure off. What is the simplest thing you can do right now to stop this from happening? How are you going to make sure that they don't come back and do the exact same thing again? Because they will. They are going to retool and they're going to come back. What's the simplest thing you can do right now to stop it from happening and better understand if it happens again? Now, simple is not changing the core logic of your, or making huge architectural decisions. That's not what I mean when I say simple. That's going to be long and impactful, and most likely is going to be more of a detriment than a benefit. The simplest thing that you can do will be to prove to yourself what has to happen in order to feel good about restoring your service safely. That's the simplest thing you can do. Okay. Now this one is more for the leaders and the stakeholders and the budget owners in the room, but I will say managing expectations with business leaders and stakeholders is super important, right? Particularly in the midst of a cyber attack, because one of the first things that is going to happen is that there's just going to be a lot of pressure to turn it back on. We've got to hit our RTO, we've got to hit our RPO. We just get the thing back on, we're losing money for every hour, every second, every minute it's down. Recognize this, that the story will change. What you know in minute 1 will be wildly different than what you know in minute 101. And that's true of both operational incidents and security incidents. What happens with security incidents, though, is that all of a sudden there are liability issues. All of a sudden there are requirements to disclose or not disclose, depending upon the nature of what was taken or what was accessed. As more information comes to light, things are going to balloon and change, and the story will go left and right and center, and it's important for people to recognize that, hey, like that is going to happen. What you should focus on is leading with the truth and talking about what you know, what you don't know, what you're working to know, and what you will never know, because otherwise you're just going to waste a lot of time with people asking you the same question that you may never know the answer to. Particularly for the budget owners, it will cost money to fix this problem. If that is not apparent, I want to make it apparent. It will cost money. The reason why it happened in the first place is because there was some amount of underinvestment in this product, in this service, in fixing this system, right? Everything that happens in the first few hours are Band-Aids at best, and the attacker is going to retool, and they're going to come back at you again, trying to get around it and achieve their aims, right? So fully fixing the problem will require intentional investment to fix it. It doesn't have to be, you're becoming Fort Knox, and there's a way to do it so that it's cost effective, but recognize that it will not be zero cost, and it has to be prioritized. So after the attack, right? First of all, come back when it makes sense. Again, I come back to that metric of what is that integrity recovery point? Can you assert and affirm, can you validate for sure that you've taken the steps that are necessary to prevent this from happening again, and that this service is operating safely before you fully recover it? There will be a gray area between the time when you're partially operating and the time when you're fully operating, where you may not have the opportunity to say this is a fully safe service, but you do need to be crisp in the answer of what does it take to be fully safe, so that way you can fully restore. Vendors, of course, need to demonstrate. They have to demonstrate their controls. If they were part of the attack, if the attack originated from them, they need to be able to demonstrate that they have taken the steps to do what they need to do to be ready to come back and attach themselves to your systems, your platform, your services, right? And I don't mean them throwing you a dusty pen test report or some old SOC 2 bridge letter. That's not what I'm talking about. They need to actually sit with an engineer on your team and one of their engineers. They need to show you their logs. They need to show you their alerts. They need to show you their SIM. They need to show you that they've rotated keys. They need to actually show you what they've done, and not just kind of give you the brush off, because they're trying to restore their revenue stream too. Finally, last little bit is you want to make yourself a harder target going into the next phase of your service's life, right? So I'm going to say 3 things that you got to do right now, or that I recommend that you take a look into doing right now. The first is building break glass accounts. If you're going to take the step of building a break glass account, and a break glass account is essentially a set of accounts that you can use to get yourself back into a server, a system, in the event that an attacker has accessed it, right? If you're going to take the step of building break glass accounts, please do not store them on Google Drive. That's all I'm going to say about that. Don't put them on Google Drive, because they're useless. If you're going to go down that path, it needs to be on a piece of paper, behind a locked door, inside of a watertight envelope that somebody knows how to access and that they continuously attempt to access, right? That needs to be a process that you exercise at least quarterly. The next is investing in service account governance. Now, I'm positive, you don't have to raise your hands, but I know it's true, but I am positive that there's somebody out here that's got a service account attached to somebody's name, and that person left the company a decade ago, but you can't shut it down because otherwise it'll tank the whole business, right? It'll tank some core operating process. You can't do that. We got to figure out a way to get ourselves to a place where we treat machine-to-machine communications with as much care as we would in human-to-machine communications, right? So your service accounts need to be governed in the same way, with the same stringency, and maybe even higher stringency as your human accounts. And then finally, think about putting together a big red button for key rotation. What we see in practice is that attackers are taking keys. They're taking tokens that they find in GitHub, that they find in plain text, that they find on people's desktops, and they're capturing them and they're just replaying them. So when that happens, you do need a way to very quickly revoke your keys, and I don't mean just a key for a specific service. I mean all the keys across the board, knowing that, again, it's a big red button, everything's going to stop. Everything's going to stop. But it's a way for you to at least get back control of the ship, right? Now, I talked fairly quickly about a lot of different topics. So again, you are going to get these slides. If you do want to learn more about threat modeling and creating a disaster recovery plan, practices for key management and reporting incidents, I've attached the links in here. Do feel free to connect with me. I will say this, I'm shying away from social media. I think a lot of people are, more and more. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm going to ask that you let me know that you saw me at Code Freeze, or we talked at Code Freeze, so that way I know you're not a salesperson, because I will ignore it otherwise. You can also reach me on Mastodon. I'm starting to get into that. And if you want to email me directly, you can always reach out to me on my website, yolandasmith.com. That's the last little bit of my talk. Hopefully you learned a little something about what it takes to fight through an attack. Please do, with the QR code, scan it and fill out the survey. Let us know how we did here today. And thank you all. I think we have 1 minute for questions.
Hi, Yolanda. Thank you for the great talk. I work for a global company, and so in terms of reporting and time zone issues as you manage the security work, any thoughts on like how to deal with working for a global company under attack?
That's a great question. So ultimately, what we see in global companies is that we have decentralized governance, right, of these types of practices. You definitely want to follow the laws of the local, the local environment where the event occurred. They may have specific reporting requirements and reporting agencies. However, you can't leave the larger global, security team out of the loop here. So it's important to kind of do both. You've got to kind of parallelize your efforts and make sure that, particularly if U.S. persons are involved in that global event, that you may find yourself talking to attorneys generals for those U.S. persons and dealing with that. The flip side of the coin is what happens if you have an event that affects, let's say people that are part of the EU. It would be the same kind of a thing, right? So you do have reporting requirements back to, depending upon where that person is from, back to that person's country of record, right? So you have to kind of parallelize the efforts there and ensure that, yes, you're following local laws and customs with respect to who to report to and when, but that you're not leaving your global team kind of in the dust. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. Shy crowd. All right, thanks everybody.
Let's thank Yolanda for a great talk. She'll be around. If you have more, we can take questions and discussions offline. We have a short 10-minute break. We are going to have 2 workshops. Workshop 1 is going to be in that room, Johnson room. That's the hands-on practical workshop. And workshop 2 is going to be here in the Memorial Hall. And you have about 10 minutes to figure out where you are headed and take a break.